So it's always a weird challenge when you interview your friends, because it's like, I don't know how to introduce you because I'm used to talking to you about being in the same alumni organization and what's going on in our lives and what we want, our dreams and our hopes and our aspirations. But my guest today is my friend, Lara Kallander. And Lara, can you introduce yourself so that I don't misrepresent you to the podcast listening world?
Absolutely right. So welcome. Thank you for having me, or I guess you're supposed to welcome me. Whoops.
Yeah. Welcome to Better Than Fine.
Super excited to be here and talk to you about what I've been up to lately. But basically my background is I studied science in school. I got a PhD in chemistry because I really wanted to help people. And I worked in pharmaceuticals for about 18 years. And I started out loving it, and then I liked it, and then I stopped loving it somewhere along the way.
Womp.
And it wasn't the job itself, it was really the fit for me. So what I knew was I went into pharmaceuticals to help people, and I might help somebody 5 or 10 years down the road, but I felt too distant from the people I was trying to help. And I didn't really know how to move careers because I had this great successful career, looked great on paper, all that kind of stuff. So I pivoted to a master's degree in positive psychology, and that led me to coaching, which is like the most fun job ever.
Ditto, agree, 100%.
I love coaching people. It's so fun to work with folks that are going through challenges and help them see things in a new way or come to things with a new approach. And in the meantime, honestly, like right before that transition to MAP, I had a health issue, very serious. My daughter had a health issue that was very serious. And that kind of drew me to that, like, I need to make a change sooner rather than later kind of motivation, if you will. And those are things I just put together now in a book called Thriving Through Adversity that's helping other people going through serious health issues. So all one big circle of things that I'm excited about and doing.
I'm so glad that I had asked you to do the intro this time, because I think that you highlight a few things that really any of us can latch onto. And it's funny because this has kind of been a theme in recent episodes, is the idea that purpose is not static. And that, you went into your first career believing like, oh, this is how I'm meant to contribute in the world. Like, I'm going to help people through my very, very smart science brain in these very specific ways that eventually weren't resonating with you anymore. And then you found a new way to use your very, very smart science brain with a different kind of science. I know one iteration of that has been teaching at the university level, but using the tools of positive psychology to teach the sciences that you have your background in, but using all of those skill sets together. And I know that's not primarily what you do now, but I think it's just another great example of like, purpose doesn't have to be singular, because you evolved through your unique experiences and interests to be in your fit now. And I'm certain that where you're going to be 3 years from now is not where we are in this conversation right now. And that's one thing that I hear in that story. I don't know if you would like to reflect any thoughts on that.
No, absolutely. I think it's been interesting for me because a lot of my chemistry colleagues thought, why would you leave to do coaching? And it didn't make sense. And there are not many chemistry coaches, I will say, right? It is a disparate, there are very different kinds of fields, but for me, it's all around this well-being. Like once you figure out what your core purpose is, it's about helping people with their well-being. It all makes sense to me. Like I look back and I go, see, all the stars line up. And I can tell you, like you said, I'm sure 3 to 5 years, it'll be slightly different, but it'll still be helping people with their well-being.
Yeah. And any coaching you're going to do is going to be informed by what you've done before. Like that's one of the beautiful things about coaching.
Absolutely.
Which we could go on about, but this is not a coaching podcast. Tell us a bit about Thriving Through Adversity. How did you come to make this book in this moment?
So I actually was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2013, which now seems like a long time ago.
Yeah.
And then 9 months later, my daughter had a completely unrelated illness. She was hospitalized for a long time. And it took us a while to get back on our feet, right? To be honest, just sort of recovering from all of that. I call it moving from surviving to thriving, right? But it took us a couple years sort of to get back on our feet. And in that process, at one point where when I was a caregiver, I thought, I really wish all the information was in the same place and that there was just like something to make this not be so unbearable in the moment. So I had this flash of inspiration of a way to have a journal that captures what you're going through and some sort of advice along the way. But I didn't know that one existed, or I wouldn't have known where to find it. So I had that inspiration. I remembered it. I've been carrying it with me all these years, right? So I was still working in pharmaceuticals. I wouldn't have known how to publish anything. It just sort of sat dormant for a while. Then I did my master's degree in positive psychology. And during the studies there, I kept thinking, should I bring this up? Should it be related to my capstone in some way? But I wasn't ready. I don't know how to explain it. Like when you've been through something, you either are or are not ready to talk about it or engage about it. And I wasn't ready. And again, it sat quiet. And I kept having coaching calls where people were coaching me, and they would say, like, on your deathbed, what's that one thing you're going to be so glad you did? And I would cry and I would say, I want to write this journal. I want to publish it. I knew it was like speaking to me in a really important way. Last summer, we put my mom's ashes to rest. She had passed the year before and we couldn't get together because of COVID. But I came home from that and I was like, I'm ready. And I don't really know exactly what switched between being not ready and being ready, but it was the summer of 2021 and I was ready.
I think of it like it was brewing, it was percolating, right? Like either the tea is ready or it's not. If you have ever percolated, like really percolated a pot of coffee, there's that magic window where it tastes good and it's either too weak or it's burnt.
It's
And
bitter,
you were percolating, and then
yeah.
it came to its time.
And I honestly look at even my publishing journey and I think I would not have been able to do this if I hadn't done all that percolating, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Because all of a sudden last summer, it seemed like finding an illustrator and finding somebody to help me publish it was not a big deal. That was no longer the hard part. Like those had held me back before, but now I'm like, oh, I have this friend on Facebook. I'll reach out to them. And, I know people who work with this woman, Diana, who helps people publish. I'll reach out to her, and boom, boom, boom. Like 3 months later, it's available for sale on Amazon.
Well, and so I want to talk about the journal itself for a second,
Yeah.
because, it's no secret to anyone who listens to the show, I have a chronic illness. My grandmother's had a ton of medical stuff this year. I've talked about it on the show a ton. I work specifically with people who have chronic illnesses as a subset of my client base. And one of the things that is really difficult when you're like going through that moment is symptom journaling. It's like, okay, the doctor wants me to record all the things that are happening to me, or I need to keep my data in line. And it becomes this tool that you have to have, but that you really resent. And if you don't have it, it's way harder to be in that moment trying to communicate with your practitioners, especially if whatever you have causes brain fog. Like there's so many other layers to it. And so anybody who's either been that person or been a caregiver for that person listening probably is familiar with that feeling of like, this fucking journal. Which one of the things I appreciate about what you have done is kind of flip that paradigm on its head. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, so the way I've come at this from somewhat of a scientific perspective, right? So we learned about things like post-traumatic growth and the positive psychology program.
Tell us about post-traumatic growth, please.
Post-traumatic growth is not just resilience, which is bouncing back. Post-traumatic growth is you've gone through a trauma, there's a healing phase, then you can look back and see some silver linings for what you went through. You will never be happy that you went through that trauma, right? It never makes it like okay. But you can look back and say, maybe I learned something from this experience. Maybe I'm putting my energy in a new direction that's useful for me. I mean, this is what happened to me, right? I changed careers because of post-traumatic growth, right? I don't think I would have done it if I hadn't gone through what I went through. So there's my silver lining. So the idea is, we know, from research that if you journal about the feelings that you're having, the genuine feelings when you're having them and you're going through this kind of an experience, it can help set the stage for post-traumatic growth. So I don't know that this journal is really enough to have somebody go from trauma to post-traumatic growth. There are probably other support along the way.
We've not done some kind of study to prove this specifically, however.
Right. But there are things in here that support that and build towards that. So the journal itself is really about capturing high level, who you saw, what your questions were, the discussion at the appointment, next steps, and then how do you feel about your situation? What do you want to remember about what's going on for you today? So it's a snapshot in time sort of for each visit that you have with a medical practitioner or a treatment. And then there's uplifting commentary there's this cute one. I'll just hold up the picture too. It says, what are your 3 favorite funny movies? And then it says, watch one of these tonight. And there's a picture of people watching a funny movie, sitting on the couch and laughing. And it's just a reminder to take those moments of levity when you can. It doesn't mean that every day you can do that, but there are moments where you just have to, like, I don't know, take a break from whatever it is that you're dealing with. Bring in some of those positive emotions along the way so that it's not just all suffering.
So one of the major criticisms of positive psychology that I'm sure I can hear like scratching at the minds of some people listening, right? It's this toxic positivity idea of like, oh, well, if I've just found out that I have
Yeah.
cancer, MS, a, a, I'll use myself as a personal example. On Friday, I went to get assessment for LASIK. I've worn glasses since I was 7 years old. I was like finally ready to have my eyes lasered. Well, it turns out that my condition is one of the things that makes you not a candidate for LASIK. And it's just one more little thing. And it's not that big of a deal, but it's one more little thing that it feels like my genetics, I get stolen from me, right? And when
Yeah.
you have a thing, whatever your thing is, it does feel like these little things get stolen. And in the face of
Absolutely.
that, the criticism of like, well, how is watching a funny movie tonight really going to matter? So what do you say to that challenge to someone who says these little things aren't that big of a deal when like my life is at stake in some, significant examples, right?
Right. Right. And I think that there's there part of it is deciding what you're open to and what you're not open to, right? And I have other illustrations and suggestions. My favorite one is this one that says, if you feel like the rug was just ripped from underneath you, accept that some ways it probably was. And there's a picture of this, woman sort of just getting thrown off. Give yourself time to adjust to new information and new expectations. So that's that reality piece, right? Like, I'm not trying to sugarcoat or pretend that everything is honky dory and like shove it under the rug, because that doesn't solve anything. But at the same time, there are moments in time that we can make choices. And if we're open to a funny movie and we can make that choice, it might lift our spirits. It's not to say you have to make that choice. But one of the things I recommend in the book too is like move around between the different prompts and see which ones speak to you. Like some of these may not speak to you, and that's okay too.
Yeah. Well, and I think you bring up a good point, right? That like any positive priming, any emotion work, like we're not saying that the challenging things and the difficult things in life don't exist or that you shouldn't feel them, or it's
Yeah.
meant to be a reminder that these other things are also there and accessible, even when you're like going through it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it can make a huge difference. I mean, one of the research papers that really got me thinking about this, I probably saw this 2 or 3 years ago now, was one where they set up intervention groups for people who were newly diagnosed with HIV. And they had one group where they were teaching them mindfulness and gratitude and acts of kindness, and one where they were teaching them something else. I forget what the topic was. But learning these things in a group for people newly diagnosed with HIV, it affected, it reduced depression for them. And it also reduced the incidence of like negative thoughts. And so that's why we do it. Like, we know there's data for gratitude for most people. We do it with thousands of people. We average the data. Gratitude helps most people. But I want to make sure, does gratitude help people who are struggling with a serious health issue? Because that seems like a slightly different group of folks. And sure enough, yeah, we have data to show that gratitude and mindfulness and these things that we've learned in positive psychology, they do still have a positive effect, even though folks are going through a really, really challenging time. So,
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point that like the point of these kinds of tools is not to erase the challenge. It's to me, in my own life, I hurt my back over the weekend. I couldn't move for 2 days. It was very,
mm,
very painful.
mhm,
And if I can take some mindful breaths and take a moment and remind myself to, to explore some gratitude, like that takes some of the emotional edge off of a problem that cannot be solved in the moment, right? Because there's the physical pain that I'm enduring, and
yeah,
then there's the emotional suffering that I put on top of it. And there is a difference between pain and suffering. And so
absolutely.
like maybe that physical experience is still there, but the lens which you experience it through is subjective. And we know that, whether we're talking about pain or psychological suffering. And the practices that we choose, I think of them as a kind of nutrition. Like, what am
Mm-hmm.
I nourishing my emotional landscape with right now? And I think part of why this is important right now is like everyone has just gone through 2 years of chronic stress,
Absolutely.
right? So regardless of the listener who's enjoying this episode and doesn't have, thank God you don't have a chronic illness or someone you love isn't sick right now, but we've all just had 2 years of chronic stress.
Yeah.
And so the lens to me still applies, that the kinds of practices you're talking about can be used to color that experience with intention towards something more positive and or enduring or durable or whatever. I don't know. Thoughts?
No, absolutely. I think you framed it up even better than I did. So we had a phrase in our coach training program that said, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? And we
Yeah.
would like grapple with that. And it's really about this premise that suffering is more of a complicated, as you said, it's your emotional lens. And still, I don't like it sometimes because I think um, it can make the person who's sick feel like suffering is a choice, and then they beat themselves up because they're suffering, right? So it's not to be used against you,
No.
but it can be used as sometimes you can find an exit strategy, right?
Yeah.
Like as you said, you hurt your back, the pain is the pain, but deciding how and what. But there will still be moments in that where the pain is just like, you're like, oh, I just can't stand it, right?
Oh
And that's
yeah.
okay too.
Oh,
So
we were living in it. Yes, very much. And I appreciate you reflecting that back, because I think for me, when I say it, I mean it as like there's a potential, there's a possibility, right? And
right.
when my prognosis when I was first diagnosed was pretty poor, and I was
Mhm.
basically told to accept a life being completely sedentary. And
Yeah.
there wasn't like, I couldn't Google it and find somebody who was living a different set of choices. And so I took my own leaps of faith.
Mm,
And so I know that there are people out in the world who don't have that intuition or don't think that it's possible to not be reactive to whatever kind of pain we're talking about. And it's
right.
that the potential exists to just make that little space, that little moment, right? And that's what these
Absolutely.
kinds of, to me, what these kind of practices are about, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So what kinds of practices do you think give that positive nudge, whether they're in the book or otherwise? Like, what do you see
Yeah.
that makes that little window?
I mean, one of my favorite ones is acts of kindness. So this is, Sonia Lyubomirsky's work, but it could be simple things like, holding a door for somebody, saying thank you when somebody makes your sandwich, that kind of thing. But sometimes it's more involved. It can be helping a neighbor get groceries, right? During COVID time, that's one of the things that we think about for sure.
Yep.
Or helping people and, whatever, getting a ride somewhere, that kind of thing. But I really like that one. I think it just suits me naturally. And so I fall into it and then I go, oh, look, I'm doing acts of kindness. Right. So it's easier to slip into. But I think that's an important one. I think mindfulness is another really important tool. And actually, you reminded me of a mindfulness tool that I use when I have pain, because usually I have pain on one side of my body. And I don't even know where I learned this from, but I'll breathe in and out and I'll feel the pain. And then I breathe in and out and I feel the lack of pain on the other side of my body. And then I go back and
Hmm.
forth a few times and the pain kind of dissipates or lessens on that side of the body that hurts. And it's just I mean, I can sit down for a minute and do it and the pain lessens,
Oh, that's so
it's,
interesting. I'm doing it now.
yeah.
Because I'm still having back pain, and I'm like,
I'm
oh yeah, that works in a way that I had never intuited before.
And I
Interesting.
think it's because you're not clued into that part of your body that
Oh
doesn't
yeah.
hurt.
Oh yeah.
You have all these parts of your body that don't hurt, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. But it's so
Um,
easy, like if anyone's done body scan meditation, right? I'm
mhm,
moving from body part to body part. And I know for me, when I do body scan meditations, it's emotionally very uncomfortable if I'm in pain when I'm doing them, because I'm constantly getting yanked to the
right,
part that hurts.
right.
But to your point, there's all these other things that we can try to focus on
Yeah,
to move the lens away from the suffering, essentially.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and positivity, I think, is really important too. There's some positive examples in there, but I ever since when I had my cancer diagnosis, I don't watch TV news. Like I get my news from the newspaper or from the radio. Like there's certain things I was like, I don't need this negativity bias in my life, and I can find ways to get the information that I need. So maybe that's a bit of a radical approach, but
Share what negativity bias is.
so negativity bias is sort of our natural ability to protect ourselves. If you think about how our ancestors survived, like living in the wild or wherever else, they would respond when they heard a noise, or if they see something threatening, respond in a way to protect themselves. That's how we get to be here today. And so it's sort of built into our brains and our bodies to pay very close attention to negative information and retain it very effectively. And so one of the reasons the gratitude practice is so powerful is because it's sort of retraining your brain to pay attention to the good things. Like it's like the parts of your body that don't hurt. We have so many good things happen to us all day long and we don't notice them, right? All the things that go right. But with that one day, your coffee cups, your coffee's not ready on time. You're like, oh my gosh, so, the world's coming to an end. So it's a way of training your brain to pay attention to the positive things.
I have two reflections on this. The first is that I have compassion for the person whose coffee not being ready on time, that's your world ending event because you have not been through enough challenge. And I just personally added a layer through your example of the oh, for all the times that I'm mad at the parts of me that hurt or that joint is in the wrong position and I can't get it back into place and blah, blah, blah. Like I'll just get angry. I'm like, why does it have to be different? Not just feeling the parts that don't hurt, but being grateful that those parts don't hurt because they might hurt tomorrow. It's like, all right, my fingers on my right hand don't hurt today. I can appreciate that.
It does take a moment, right, to get there though, for sure.
Yeah. And layering those things. I mean, a moment. I got diagnosed like 15 years ago and we're still playing this game, which also is, I think, helpful to realize is like, it's a process and it's a process that people move in and out of.
Absolutely.
It's not a one and done. Like this kind of choice is funny. This is what my newsletter's on this week is like the act of choosing to renew that, like refresh the well, fill the bucket, whatever we want to call it, continually, because the new challenge is going to come. The next big, I know you're not watching network TV news and neither am I, but the next, oh my God, is going to drop into our laps eventually.
Right.
And what do we do with it? Who do we choose to show up as? Right.
Yeah. And how do we appreciate the moments now when there's so many things to be grateful for now, right? That may or may not be true in the future, right? There's no guarantees.
Right.
So
right. Even when you're going through stuff. Yeah. So where might we find Thriving Through Adversity? I know you mentioned it's on Amazon. And where do we find you?
Yeah. So I have a website called thrivingthroughabversitycoaching.com. And that's where I do my coaching business. So those are good places to find me.
And the book. Don't forget the book.
And the book is Thriving Through Adversity on Amazon.com.
Fantastic. Final thoughts at all?
No, this was lovely.
Yeah, this was very fun. Thank you.
Yeah.